A mother, two kids, a frozen Detroit winter, no gas, almost no heating oil, and a husband stuck in a 4-hour line on the coldest night of the year. 1973 was the year America ran dry, and the year ordinary families discovered exactly how strong they actually were. This is one of those families, and what this mother did with a bicycle, a spiral notebook, and a cast-iron stove she bought for $25 is something every single person watching this in 2026 needs to hear. November in Detroit always smelled like wood smoke and cold pavement, the kind of cold that crept under your collar before you even made it to the mailbox. But in the autumn of 1973, the Kowalski house on Elmwood Drive glowed warm and golden from every window, and if you stood on the sidewalk and looked in, you might have thought you were looking at a painting of everything America was supposed to be. Doris Kowalski was 34 years old, and she was, by every ordinary measure, living an ordinary life, and she loved it. She loved the particular chaos of Tuesday mornings when Caleb couldn't find his left sneaker and Ruth wanted her hair in pigtails and Gerald was already backing the station wagon out of the driveway, engine rumbling, coffee thermos balanced on the roof. She loved the weight of a full grocery bag on each arm and the smell of a pot roast coming together slowly on a Wednesday afternoon. She loved the way the kitchen light made everything look warmer than it actually was. Gerald worked the line at the Ford plant in Dearborn. Good, honest union work. It put food on the table, kept the lights on bright, and filled the tank of that enormous 1971 Ford Country Squire station wagon, the one with the fake wood paneling on the sides that Doris secretly loved and publicly pretended to tolerate. Gas was cheap. Nobody thought about gas the way people thought about groceries or rent. You pulled in, the attendant filled it up, you handed over a couple of dollars, and you drove away. Simple as breathing. That October, Doris had already started making her Christmas list. She'd circled a toy drum set for Caleb in the Sears catalog and a baby doll with real closing eyes for Ruth. Gerald had picked up extra shifts, and they were quietly, carefully hopeful about the coming holidays. Life felt full. Not flashy, just full. The way a good meal feels when everyone at the table is laughing. The television was always on in the evenings. Walter Cronkite's steady voice was as familiar as a neighbor's, and that fall the news had been loud and complicated in the way news sometimes gets. Something about a war in the Middle East, Egypt and Syria and Israel, a place called the Sinai, tank columns moving at dawn. Gerald would watch with his arms folded and his jaw set, the way men of his generation watched trouble from far away. Doris would half listen from the kitchen, catching words between the sound of running water and the clatter of dishes. Yom Kippur, embargo, OPEC. She didn't know what OPEC was, not yet. The first sign came on a Thursday. Gerald had pulled the country squire into their regular mobile station on Telegraph Road, the one with the friendly attendant named Phil, who always wiped the windshield without being asked. But Phil wasn't smiling that afternoon, and the station was quiet in a way that felt wrong, the way a schoolyard is quiet when something bad has already happened. Hanging from the pump, swaying slightly in the cold November wind, was a hand-lettered cardboard sign, "Sorry, no gas." Gerald sat in the car for a long moment, engine idling, staring at those 3 words. Then he pulled back onto Telegraph Road and drove home without saying much. Doris knew the moment she saw his face at the back door that something had shifted. Something quiet and heavy had settled over their little corner of Elmwood Drive. She just didn't know yet how long it planned to stay. The date was October 17th, 1973. And it would quietly become one of those dates that divides a life into before and after, even if most ordinary families like the Kowalskis didn't fully understand it yet. The members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had made their decision. In response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Arab oil-producing nations announced an embargo. They would no longer ship oil to the United States. Just like that. A spigot turned. And the effects, though they didn't arrive all at once, began moving toward every suburb, every filling station, every kitchen table in America, like a slow and very cold tide. The numbers were staggering once people started to understand them. A barrel of oil that had cost just $3, was now clawing its way toward 12. Overnight, energy went from being something invisible and taken for granted to something people talked about at the dinner table, in grocery lines, at church. Doris heard it everywhere, at the school pickup, at the beauty parlor, at the checkout counter at Kroger. A low, anxious murmur that hadn't existed in October was suddenly just part of the air in November. Gerald felt it first, the way men who work with their hands always feel economic trouble first, in the body, before the mind catches up. The Ford plant was cutting back production hours. Smaller cars, someone said. The future was smaller cars. He'd come home quieter than usual, eating dinner without his usual commentary on the Lions' latest disappointment, sitting closer to the television than he needed to. Doris watched him and said nothing, because she understood that sometimes silence is the kindest thing you can offer a worried man. Then came the gas lines.
Nothing quite prepared any of them for the gas lines. They appeared first as rumors. Did you hear there's a 2-hour wait on Michigan Avenue? And then as reality, stretching around entire city blocks in the gray November morning light. Cars lined up bumper to bumper, engines running, drivers slumped behind steering wheels with newspapers or thermoses of coffee. Some stations ran out before the line even cleared. Some never opened at all. Gerald joined one of those lines on a Saturday morning. He left the house at 6:15 before Caleb and Ruth were even awake. He came home at 10:30. He had 5 gallons of gas and the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 4 hours doing absolutely nothing and found it more draining than a full shift on the line. He set the keys on the counter without a word. Doris poured him coffee and didn't ask questions. Then came the rules. The government, scrambling to manage what was rapidly becoming a national crisis, introduced odd-even rationing. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could buy gas on odd-numbered days. Even plate, even days. It sounds orderly on paper. In practice, it meant Doris had to keep a mental calendar running at all times, factoring in Gerald's work schedule, Caleb's school, Ruth's doctor appointment, the grocery run, and which day of the week it happened to be, all against the backdrop of lines that might be 2 hours long or 5, depending on the station in the morning. The national speed limit dropped to 55 miles per hour. Thermostats in public buildings were ordered down. The president appeared on television and asked Americans to be patient, to conserve, to understand that this was a shared burden. Gerald watched and said the thing he always said when presidents asked things of him. Easy to say. But Doris was already thinking differently. She was already standing in the kitchen with a notepad, going through the week's errands with a new kind of precision she hadn't needed before. Grocery run. How far? School drop-off. Could Caleb walk some mornings? Gerald's commute. Non-negotiable, but maybe they could combine errands on his way home? She made small marks on the notepad. Small, careful marks. She hadn't told Gerald yet how worried she was. The bills were about to get bigger. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, in your knees, in the back of your neck. Heating oil, she knew, was already getting harder to find, and December was coming. December in Michigan was not the kind of month that negotiated. She put the notepad in the kitchen drawer, kissed Caleb on the top of his head as he ran past, and started on dinner. But her mind was already somewhere else, already 2 or 3 steps ahead, already quietly mapping a path through a winter that was shaping up to be unlike any they had faced before. The bicycle had been sitting in the garage since August. It was an old Schwinn,
powder blue, with a wide wicker basket mounted on the front and a small rear rack that Gerald had bolted on 2 summers ago so Doris could haul things back from the farmer's market on Saturdays. It had a little bell on the left handlebar that Ruth loved to ring and a headlight that worked about half the time. Doris had ridden it through the warm months without much thought, the way you use something easy and pleasant without fully appreciating it. But in November, with the country squire sitting in the driveway on odd days and the gas lines stretching longer every week, that old Schwinn stopped being a leisure item and became something else entirely. It became a lifeline. The first morning Doris rode it to school with Ruth bundled on the back rack, wrapped in her red wool coat and a knit hat pulled down over her ears. The temperature was 31 degrees. Ruth thought it was an adventure. She held on to Doris's coat with both small fists and watched the frozen front yard scroll past and declared the whole thing extremely fun. Doris smiled back at her over one shoulder and agreed, yes, extremely fun, while her fingers went numb around the handlebars and the cold air burned the back of her throat. She did not let Ruth see any of that. That became its own kind of discipline, the careful management of her own face, her own voice, her own small reactions, so that Caleb and Ruth moved through their days without the weight of worry that Doris carried for all four of them. Children absorb everything. Doris knew that the way all mothers know it, deep and wordlessly. So she kept her expression even, kept her voice light, kept the dinner table warm with conversation and the small ordinary jokes that families build up over years like a private language. But the errands were hard. There was no softer word for it. The Kroger on Woodward Avenue was 1.5 miles away, and on grocery days Doris would load the wicker basket and strap additional bags to the rear rack and ride home with her coat pressed flat against her chest by the wind, legs burning on the slight uphill stretch of Elmwood Drive, fingers aching by the time she turned into the driveway. She started planning meals with a new kind of precision, buying only what she needed for the exact number of days before her next trip, eliminating anything heavy or awkward to carry on a bicycle in November. At the gas stations, things were getting uglier. She'd seen it with her own eyes on a Tuesday morning. 2 men in separate cars at a station on Telegraph Road, both claiming the same pump, voices rising in the cold air, one of them jabbing a finger at the other across the hood of his car. A woman with a child in her back seat sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead, waiting for it to end. The attendant standing helplessly by the door. There was a particular desperation in those lines that Doris found more unsettling than the cold or the shortage itself. Good people, tired and frightened, briefly becoming people she didn't quite recognize. She started choosing her routes to avoid the worst stations. Then came the afternoon that she didn't avoid enough. It was a Wednesday, which meant an even day, which meant the country squire was grounded. Doris had ridden to the hardware store on Maple to pick up weather stripping for the back door. A draft had been sneaking under it for days, and she was already thinking about heating costs. And then to the Kroger, and by the time she was loaded up and heading home, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind had swung around to the northwest with serious intentions. She was on Crescent Road, about 1 mile from the house, when the rear tire went flat. It didn't blow dramatically, it just softened, then sighed, then settled, and suddenly the bicycle was riding like it was made of wet cement. Doris stopped on the side of the road and looked down at the tire and felt for just a moment the full weight of everything pressing on her at once. The cold, the bags, the mile of road between her and a warm kitchen. Ruth was already home from school, being watched by the neighbor, Mrs. Hensley, but the clock was running and dinner needed starting, and there was no Gerald to call because Gerald was at work, and even if he wasn't, the car was grounded until tomorrow. She stood there for 5 seconds, maybe 10, long enough to feel it completely. Then she straightened up, repositioned the grocery bags to balance the load better, and began walking the bicycle home. It took her 40 minutes, By the time she turned onto Elmwood Drive, her feet were completely numb inside her boots, and the pewter sky had started spitting the first small needles of freezing rain. Mrs. Hensley opened the door before Doris even made it up the porch steps, took one look at her face, and quietly put the kettle on without saying a word. Doris sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea and listened to Ruth explaining a drawing she'd made at school, something involving a rainbow and what appeared to be a very large cat, and she felt something settle back into place inside her chest. Not relief exactly, more like resolve, the quiet, unspectacular kind that doesn't announce itself or ask for recognition, the kind that just gets you up the next morning and back on the bicycle. She had the tire patched by Friday. December arrived in Detroit the way it always did, without apology. The first real cold front pushed down from Canada in the first week of the month, dropping temperatures into the single digits overnight and turning every breath into a small cloud. The elm trees on Elmwood Drive stood bare and black against a white sky, and the neighborhood grew quieter in the particular way that extreme cold makes everything quiet, as though the world itself is conserving energy. In a way, that December it was. The heating oil situation had been building towards something difficult for weeks, and by early December it arrived. Prices had climbed sharply, nearly double what the Kowalskis had paid the previous winter, and delivery windows had grown uncertain and long. Their supplier, a family-run outfit out of Livonia that Gerald had used for 6 years, called to say they were doing their best but couldn't guarantee their usual schedule. They were sorry. Everyone was sorry that December. Sorry didn't warm a house. Doris made the decision quietly, the way she made most of her harder decisions, without drama, without a family meeting, without alarming the children. She walked to the hallway thermostat on a Monday morning after Gerald left for work and Caleb and Ruth had gone to school, and she turned it down to 62 degrees. She stood there for a moment with her hand still on the dial, looking at the number. Then she went to the linen closet and began pulling out every extra blanket they owned. She closed off the guest room entirely. The door to the basement stayed shut. She rolled towels against the bottoms of exterior doors and reapplied the weather stripping she'd bought on that bicycle trip that now felt like it belonged to a different, slightly warmer life. She moved the family's evening life into the living room, which was the smallest room that faced south and held heat the best, and she arranged the couch and chairs into a tighter circle around the floor lamp and the small electric space heater she'd found at the back of the garage. Caleb adapted immediately, the way 8-year-old boys adapt to anything that involves extra blankets and the implicit permission to stay in one warm room all evening. Ruth was quieter about it. Ruth noticed things. She was 6 years old with very large, very serious brown eyes, and she had a way of watching her mother's face that sometimes made Doris feel gently and completely seen. It was Ruth who woke up shivering. It was a Thursday night, close to 2 in the morning, when Doris heard the small sound from down the hall, not quite crying, not quite calling out, just a thin, high thread of distress that a mother's sleeping ears are tuned to catch from any depth of sleep. She was in Ruth's room before she was fully awake. Ruth was sitting up in bed with her blankets pulled to her chin, her small shoulders shaking, her breath coming out in the faintest visible puffs in the dim light from the hallway. She hadn't accounted for the wind finding the gap at the base of Ruth's window, a small architectural imperfection that hadn't mattered in previous winters because the heat had simply overwhelmed it. It mattered now. Doris didn't say anything reassuring and hollow. She simply climbed into Ruth's bed, pulled every blanket over both of them, and wrapped herself around her daughter the way a body understands to do before the mind has caught up. Ruth stopped shaking within a few minutes. Her breathing slowed and deepened. Doris lay there in the dark listening to it and making a list in her head. Wood stove. She needed a wood stove. She'd been hearing about them for weeks. The 1973 oil crisis had triggered something of a run on wood stoves across the Midwest. Hardware stores sold out within days. Classified ads in the free press were full of them. Neighbors talked about them over fences in the freezing air, the way they'd once talked about new cars. Doris started calling around the next morning. The hardware store on Maple sold out. The one on Orchard Lake Road sold out, waiting on a shipment that may or may not arrive before January. A place in Pontiac, one left, cast iron, second-hand, and the man on the phone had 3 other people interested, and could she come today? She could not come today. The country squire was grounded again, and Gerald was at work, and the bus didn't go out that far. By the time she got through to Gerald on his lunch break and explained the situation, the stove in Pontiac was gone. But Gerald came home that evening with a name written on a scrap of paper, a man named Dale Hutchins, 2 streets over, who was selling a small cast-iron parlor stove out of his garage because he just had a gas insert put in his fireplace and no longer needed it. $25. Gerald went over that same evening with cash, and the 2 of them loaded it into Dale's truck and had it sitting in the Kowalski living room by 8 o'clock. It needed a proper flue connection, and Gerald spent most of that Saturday making it work safely, consulting with Dale and a neighbor named Ron, who'd done something similar the previous week. But by Saturday evening, a small, steady fire was burning in the parlor stove, and the living room held a warmth that the thermostat at 62 degrees had not been able to manufacture. A deep, radiant, honest heat that pressed against your face and made the whole room smell faintly of pine. Caleb sat cross-legged in front of it doing his homework. Ruth lay on her stomach beside him, coloring, close enough to the warmth that her cheeks went pink. Gerald sat in his chair with his newspaper and didn't say much, but his shoulders had dropped from around his ears for the first time in weeks. Week of December. Gerald had called from the plant to say he was stopping for gas on the way home. Their supplier had pushed the heating oil delivery back again. The tank gauge was dropping toward the red, and they needed that gas to keep the backup electric baseboard running in the kids' rooms through the night. The line at the station on Michigan Avenue was already long when Gerald pulled in at 5:30. Doris knew this because he called from a payphone at the station, his voice carefully even in the way voices get when a person is deliberately not alarming anyone. The parlor stove was burning steadily in the living room, but steadily was not the same as sufficiently, not on a night when the temperature outside was dropping toward 0 and the wind was pressing against every window in the house like something that wanted to come in. Doris fed the stove through the evening, keeping the fire small and controlled and consistent the way Dale had shown Gerald to do it. She made hot cocoa for Caleb and Ruth and let them stay up later than usual, all 4 of them in the living room together, the fire throwing orange light across the walls. Gerald finally came through the back door at 9:47. He had gas. He had the particular gray exhaustion of a man who had sat in a cold car in a long line for over 4 hours and had kept himself from showing it. He set the gas cans down in the kitchen, and Doris handed him a bowl of soup she'd kept warm on the back burner, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. They didn't need to. They were still standing. The fire was still burning. The children were asleep under every blanket in the house, warm and safe and entirely unaware of how much effort that warmth had required. That was enough. For that night, it was exactly enough.